ago in the back classroom. And since we've got a shortened amount of time, I'm going to preload. You guys, you get the spoilers up front, right? So Daniel, some cool things about him that make him stand out is there's nothing spectacular about him. There's no crazy, miraculous superpowers. His superpower was his faith in God, right? And how that played out throughout his life. He was consistent in his actions no matter how crazy things got around him. And his example helped spread God's glory. It started out small, and as we'll see, we've got a few stories. Hopefully we can get to most of them. It started out small with just a handful of people. And as his life went on, God's glory spread. So let's start out with the first chapter, the first story, and the first slide here is corrupted. So you get half of it. There we go. Daniel chapter 1. I've highlighted a couple of verses from each of these stories that we're going to talk about, and we're going to go through it real quick, and then hopefully we'll have time for comments or questions or insights that you guys have later on. Daniel chapter 1, this is the introduction to who is this guy, and it talks about his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Also, let's read this verse here, chapter 1 and verse 8. So, a little background before we do. The Israelites were captive. An invading army came through. These were not so great people, and they gathered up all of the young, bright, strong people, which included Daniel, and assimilated them into their culture. Daniel and his friends, amongst many others. And part of this process was to feed them some of the king's delicacies. And if you've grown up in the church, you've heard these stories before. If you're not familiar, the delicacies, the food that the king prescribed for these people, it was against the law of Moses. It was against the culture of the Israelites. And Daniel, in verse 8, chapter 1, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. So there's a couple of really cool things. And we're going to see this, like each one of these stories, you see the same things play out. It's like this cool pattern. Daniel was very respectful. Daniel was very respectful and very clear when talking to the governing authorities, right? He resolved within himself, before he spoke to anybody, he resolved within himself not to defile himself. He respectfully interacted with the authority, the chief of the eunuchs, and he asked for time so that he and his friends could not eat those foods, but eat vegetables. And then we'll find out, which one is better. Surprisingly, that God's way was better. And they got to the end of this test, and it proved that out, that Daniel and his friends, their diet was better. And it changed the culture throughout the kingdom. So not only Daniel and his friends are eating veggies, but now all of these people that are brought into this new kingdom. So the next slide is not corrupted. Here we go. The king's dream in chapter 2. Daniel answered the king. This is chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. The king's dream. The king had a dream, and he wanted to make sure that he knew what this dream meant, that the interpretation that he got from his wise men, his counselors, was accurate, and that they weren't just making something up. So he went to them and said, I want you to tell me what I dreamed, and I want you to tell me what it means. And all of his wise men and counselors, they came back and said, no man can do this. We have no idea. We can't tell you what you dreamed. This is impossible. And the king became very angry about this. He was going to slaughter all of his wise men. Word got around, Daniel found out about it, and he made an appointment with the king. Before he knew the conclusion of how he was going to do this, he made an appointment with the king, and he said, hold on, give me some time. I will tell you what your dream is and the interpretation. And in Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 and 28, Daniel answered the king and said, no wise man, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. Up till now, that's what the king's men has said. But Daniel went on and said, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So immediately, up front, Daniel makes very clear to the king, this is not coming from me. What I'm about to tell you about your dreams, this isn't coming from Daniel. No man can do what you have asked, but there is a God in heaven who can do this. And he went on to explain the king's dream. So he acted in faith before knowing the conclusion. And immediately, up front, he gave God the glory. And God was glorified before the king. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 47 and 48. So after all of this, and after Daniel made known the king's dream and the interpretation, this is how it played out. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. So God used this moment to spread his glory. And it started with the chief of the eunuchs, and now it's moved up to the king. And we're going to see how it moves on from there. Any comments or questions or insights up to this point? Yeah. Very reminiscent of Joseph. Yeah. So, yeah. It's very commendable. Yeah, so just so that everybody can hear, a young man who had that kind of a faith and being brought into an invading nation, he has no idea. I don't know if he ever learned what happened to his family back home. Were they killed in the mess? Were they lost? Were they still around? But he just didn't have contact. But to be all alone in this invading army, in this new nation, new culture, new everything, to have that kind of a faith, that's incredible. That's like a superpower. You don't need long hair and strength. All right, this next story, the fiery furnace, this isn't Daniel specifically, but I bring it up because I think it's very important to talk about the company that Daniel keeps, right? So these were his friends that he just asked the king in Daniel chapter 2. He remembered his friends. In that first story with the veggies, it was Daniel and his friends. And in the second chapter with the king and his dream, Daniel remembered his friends and asked the king, hey, promote these guys too. And here we can see God using these people. This is who Daniel hung out with, right? And it had such a big impact, I'm sure. The company that we keep is so important. The fiery furnace, very quickly, the king, what a crazy story. The king sets up a giant statue and he asks everybody in the kingdom to bow down. And everybody did. except for these three people. Daniel isn't mentioned in this chapter, so we're not sure about that. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not going to bow down. And they did so in such a powerful way. I really want to talk about these couple of verses. In chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, it says there, let's start in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. This is incredible. This is incredible. What these three men are saying to the king of this nation, they're saying, look, we don't even have to answer you in this matter. We have no need to even answer you. But if you're threatening us with death, the God that we serve is able to deliver us. And he will deliver us from your hand. Did you notice that? They're not necessarily saying that they won't be killed, but they're saying God will deliver them. And then in the next verse, even if he doesn't, we're still not going to worship your gods, and we're not going to bow down to your golden image. And we all know that this went over very well with the king. That he heated the fiery furnace multiple times. The men who had bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and brought them to the furnace, they died just bringing them into the fire. It was that hot. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew the consequences going in. They knew if we say no, there's the fire. And we're going to say no anyway. That is so powerful. And I think this speaks to Daniel's character because these are the people that he hung out with. These were his companions. Iron sharpens iron, and our social circle directly impacts our lives. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in God's ability, whether or not he would choose to save them in a physical sense. And afterwards, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said no to the king, in chapter 3, let's look at verse 28 and 29. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you see how God's glory from the actions of one man and his friends, it's like this little drop of water that has a ripple effect that goes throughout the kingdom. And we're going to see that even as we continue on. Any questions or comments about the fiery furnace, Daniel's companions, Daniel's character? Okay, chapter 6. This is the one we're super familiar with. The lion's den Uh, this one is big. And I know, like, if you've grown up in the church, you've heard this story since you were a small kid. It's a very popular children's Bible story. But it's not a story for kids, right? We simplify it to tell this story to children. And I think that's good. But sometimes, as adults, we overlook it because we associate it with a children's story. And it's not. This was written primarily for adults. So, Daniel in the lion's den. We've got a couple extra minutes. I have one more slide, so we can take some. I think we can take some insights going into this. What do you guys remember from Daniel in the lion's den? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Ooh, yeah. Yeah. That's an important point. So Daniel is much older. A cool thing about Daniel, which you pointed out, Daniel serves in his government, in the kingdom. He serves 3 different kings, at least 3 different kings. And he is faithful to God under all of those kings. Right. 2 different nations, at least 3 different kings, right? And these were not great kingdoms, okay? These were some pretty ruthless people. Daniel worked for these governments, and he was able to stay faithful to God. So when we get to the lion's den, he is much older. Many years have passed. What else? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So he is consistent throughout his life to the point that he doesn't care. He doesn't give much thought to, oh, what is so and so going to think about me if I do this, and how am I going to be perceived if I say the wrong words, or he just does what's right. And whatever the consequences happen from doing what's right, he's willing to accept. I think this hand up first. What's up? Mm, yeah, right. Right. Yeah. So, according to their laws, once the king makes a decree, you can't reverse it. There's no takebacks. When the king recognizes he's been tricked into harming Daniel, this grieves him because up until now, Daniel has proven himself a faithful servant of the king. So, when the king realizes I'm going to lose my best employee, that's going to hurt. And it grieves him. Yeah, that's a very important point. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important point. So we talked in the beginning how Daniel had no superpowers, and what you brought up is Daniel's superpower was his faith in God, and because Daniel acted in faith, God's power was magnified, and God's power was seen throughout the kingdom. Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's get through this story here real quick. We've got one more, and we'll just kind of barely touch on it, I think. So Daniel in the lion's den. There was some jealousy within the kingdom. Daniel was serving the king very faithfully. He was being promoted left and right. There were some people that Daniel worked with who didn't like that very much. And they looked into different ways of harming him, and the only thing they could find out, the only way they could hurt him, was if it was something in relationship to his worship with God. So they tricked the king into signing a decree that anybody who worships anything other than the king for a period of time, you're going to get thrown to the lions. This was certain death. There's no getting out of it. And what does Daniel do? This is so incredible. Daniel chapter 6, and in verse 10, it says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber, and he invited all of his friends, and they made signs, and they went and protested throughout all the kingdom, and they posted on social media about how angry they were at the king. No, they didn't do any of that. They didn't do it. He didn't do any of that. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So what did Daniel do? Nothing different. He didn't do anything different. He didn't make a big fuss about it. He didn't go to the king. He didn't talk to his friends. He just went about his life praying to God the way that he knew that he should. That's incredible. And this blows my mind. I was so convicted in the last few years how crazy the world has gotten. I was so convicted when I would read the book of Daniel and get to this point. I shouldn't get angry. I shouldn't be calling anybody any names. I don't need to make a big fuss or sign any petitions or like none of that crazy stuff. I should go to worship the way that I always go. I should be living my life in such a consistent manner that the governing authorities are grieved when they find out, oh, this law that we made, it's going to hurt. I should be such a good citizen that when it comes time that I need to stand up and say, I can't worship your golden idol. That the king, it's going to blow his mind. What do you mean? You obey me and everything else? Daniel is so convicting. It's so powerful. Okay, we've got 4 minutes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. So Daniel didn't rationalize a way around, well, maybe I can do this thing and nobody's really going to find out. It's just between me and God. And he didn't do any of that. His windows were open toward Jerusalem, and he prayed just like he always did. Okay, so the last one that I have, and this is so, man, We don't have time to read this whole prayer, but I encourage you. The last time I read this, it was so emotional. I couldn't get through it. And we're going to try. I don't know if we can get through the whole thing, but Daniel chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, this is verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent, a Mede. You know what? We don't have time. Those are 2 minutes. Let's just read these verses. 9, verse 18. 9, verse 18. If you guys have time, please read this. It's so, so good. Verse 17. Let's start there. Now, therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy, and for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations, and the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake. O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. This whole prayer. And if you can just imagine somebody in America in our time praying these words, because it is so fitting. This nation, their people, Daniel's people, were being destroyed and brought into captivity. And Daniel makes it very clear it's because we have sinned. It's because we forgot our God. And he gets down here to verse 18 where he begs the Lord for forgiveness. Thank you guys so much. That's it.